Okay, so my group presentation is on the Trail of Tears. The reason this came about was because a lot of people in Georgia wanted to grow crops into the South, into like expansion, but a lot of them couldn't do this because the main obstacle there was the Indians. A bunch of white settlers did come together and they did sign a petition into trying to get them to remove. Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe argued that the Indian tribes in the Southeast should exchange their lands for lands west of the Mississippi River. They did not take this step, it did not happen. Indeed, the first encounter to try to make this happen did result into war. They then took all of the Indians' military power, and was then forced upon the Indians where they had to surrender to the United States about 20 million acres of land, which is equivalent to Alabama today and one-fifth of Georgia. Andrew Jackson signed this bill in 1830, allowing them to do this, and some of the Indians did agree to leave peacefully. They didn't want any complications, so they just agreed to get their stuff up and go. A good chunk of the tribes did not agree with this, and they wanted to stay, so they didn't move. So they were forcefully moved by the US government to the the trail to leave their homeland. And during this, it was during the fall and the winter, so there were super bad conditions. It was raining, it was snowing like a food, like a water. They were exhausted most of the time. So about 4,000 of them did die. And the reason they call it the Trail of Tears is because a lot of people were crying during this journey, and that's where it's got its name from.
The Indian Removal Act of 1830 was a legislative move that allowed the enforced relocation of Native American tribes from their traditional lands to areas situated west of the Mississippi River. President Andrew Jackson signed this act into law. It was deeply connected to the historical context of the United States. The practice of displacing peoples forcefully had been ongoing for some time, driven by a quest for land expansion and disputes over resources. Starting from agreements like the Treaty of New Echota to the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek. These compelled relocations laid the groundwork for the incidents that followed with the implementation of the Indian Removal Act. The expulsion of tribes in the United States leading to the enactment of the Indian Removal Act in 1830 was influenced by historical events that played a significant role in shaping this tragic period in American history. Before the 1830s, there were instances where Native American tribes were forcibly relocated from their lands. These relocations were often driven by the U.S. government's policies, which aimed at acquiring more land for white settlers and economic growth. The outcomes of these relocations were heartbreaking, resulting in displacement, loss of lifestyles, and immense suffering within indigenous communities. According to findings presented in a publication by Nikki Michael, many Native Americans endured hardships during the forced journeys of the 1830s, with around a quarter losing their lives along the way. The implementation of the Indian Removal Act in 1830 during President Andrew Jackson's tenure intensified these relocation efforts by permitting the transfer of American tribes from their homelands to territories west of the Mississippi River. This legislation set the stage for what now remembered as the Trail of Tears, a somber period where numerous indigenous people, including Cherokee and other tribal groups, were uprooted from their territories and marched to unfamiliar lands, resulting in immense anguish and tragedy. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 was an event in American history causing great harm to Native American tribes. The Trail of Tears, a consequence of this law, represents the pain and suffering endured by countless indigenous people as they were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands. It is important to remember and reflect on this period to prevent similar injustices from happening again. The lasting effects of the Indian Removal Act remind us of the significant impact government decisions can have on marginalized communities and emphasize the importance of respecting and preserving cultures and rights today.
Tribes affected. The tribes affected by the Indian Removal Act were the agrarian tribes of the South, which included the Cherokees, Creeks, Seminoles, Chickasaws, and Choctaws. Southerners called them the five civilized tribes because they had adopted some of the cultural ways of whites, such as by using white methods for agricultural and animal husbandry, wearing white styles of clothing, and attending English-speaking missionary schools. One of the largest groups, the Cherokees, located in Georgia, had formed a sophisticated culture with their own written language called the Cherokee Syllabary. It was created by one of the most influential figures in the tribe named Sequoyah, allowing literacy and printing to flourish in the Cherokee Nation during the 19th century. The Cherokees even adopted a republican constitution with a bicameral legislature and 3 branches of government. Removal of Native American peoples to the west of the Mississippi River was intended to be voluntary, but many in the nations of the 5 civilized tribes did not take the deal to give up their lands to move west. Some had tried negotiating with white settlers and the U.S. government, offering some land and remain for peace. In particular, the Cherokee Nation had created an official protest petition as a rebuttal to the illegal signing of the Treaty of New Echota, which led to the forced removal of the Cherokees from their homeland. But it was due to the Indian Intercourse Act of 1835 that all 5 civilized tribes were to be relocated to the new Indian Territory. The act not only controlled the removal of the natives, but also set boundaries of the American Indian Reservation. The migrants faced disease, hunger, and exhaustion on the forced march. In all, more than 46,000 to 60,000 Native Americans were forced by U.S. military to relocate to Indian Territory.
During the Trail of Tears, Native Americans faced legal battles and resistances. I'm going to be talking about 2 separate court cases called Cherokee Nation versus Georgia and Worcester versus Georgia. Cherokee Nation versus Georgia was a very important case in Native American law because of its implications for tribal sovereignty and how to define the relationship between recognized tribes and the government. In the 1920s, Georgia State passed 2 laws that declared Cherokee Nation territory could be inspected, divided up, and distributed to white citizens in Georgia. These laws also provided punishments for anyone who did not comply. These laws were made for one thing, which was to force the tribe off of its reservation lands. The Cherokee Nation, which was under the leadership of Chief John Ross, sought out to make these laws unconstitutional based on the treaties signed by the Cherokee Nation and the U.S. government. They argued that the treaties provided for sovereignty and for federal protection, so the Cherokee land should not be outside of the state's jurisdiction. The court, which is led by Chief Justice John Marshall, disagreed with the fact that the Cherokee Nation was quote-unquote foreign state. Instead, Justice Marshall defined the Cherokee Nation as a domestic dependent nation. Because of this, the majority opinion argued that the court could not make a judgment on this case because it did not have the jurisdiction. In a dissenting opinion by Justice Smith Thompson, she expressed concern that the tribe did not have a forum such as the Supreme Court to where they could bring challenges when its rights were being violated. She said, and I quote, "And if they as a nation are competent to make a treaty or contract, then it would seem to be a strange inconsistency to deny them the right and the power to enforce such a contract." Now to talk about Worcester versus Georgia. In September 1831, Samuel A. Worcester, amongst other people, were indicted in the Supreme Court for the county of Genoa, Georgia. They were charged with residing within the limits of the Cherokee Nation without a license and without having taken the oath to support and defend the Constitution and the flaws of the state of Georgia. Worcester argued that the statute violated the Constitution, treaties between the states and Cherokee Nation, and an act of Congress entitled "An Act to Regulate Trade and Intercourse with the Indian Tribes." Because of this, Worcester was confined and sentenced to hard labor for joint for 4 years. The conclusion of this court case was that Georgia's act violated the Constitution, violated treaties, and even violated laws of the United States. The Chief Justice Marshall argued that the Cherokee Nation then is a distinct community occupying its own territory in which the laws of Georgia could have no force. This Georgia Act interfered with the federal government's authority and was therefore deemed unconstitutional.
The Trail of Tears stands as one of the darkest chapters in American history.
In the early 19th century, a forced march mandated by the U.S. government's policy of Indian removal inflicted immeasurable suffering on thousands of indigenous people and their tribes. They were forced to leave their homes and walk hundreds of miles to new lands. But it wasn't an easy journey. The conditions were terrible. They were forced to walk through harsh grounds and extreme weather conditions, as well as survive off of inadequate food and supplies. Families were separated, elders and children perished from disease and exhaustion, and many were subjected to violence and abuse at the hands of soldiers tasked with overseeing the removal. The Native Americans were pushed off their lands by the government and soldiers. They had to leave behind everything they knew and loved. This shows that the Trail of Tears was not just a physical journey, but also a spiritual and cultural one, as the Native Americans were stripped of their identities, traditions, and connections to their homelands. The suffering endured during this forced march is immeasurable, leaving deep scars that continue to impact Native communities to this day. The Trail of Tears wasn't just one trail, it was many trails that different tribes had to walk. Some had to walk over 1,000 miles. But even though they faced so much hardship, the Native Americans showed incredible strength and resilience. They kept going, even when things seemed hopeless. The Trail of Tears is a sad reminder of the injustices that the Native people face, but it's also a testament to their courage and determination.